now to turn to the election, I'm going to present what I think is a sober analysis of what happened in 2020 today, and especially in the national presidential elections. And I'm going to refer to Trump's second red wave, and I'll try to show you what I mean as we go through. But I want to be clear, I do think that in a sense, one of the things as we do our election autopsy, we need to acknowledge is not only did Joe Biden clearly win this election, and by the way, right, this has gone up over 300 since Georgia and North Carolina have been called, and so Biden is at 306, which ironically perhaps is exactly the number that Donald Trump won in the Electoral College 4 years ago. We've now also got the results from all the Senate races except for the 2 in Georgia that are going to runoffs, and the Republicans have an advantage of 50 to 48. So the only way the Democrats gain control of the Senate, the only way, therefore, that Joe Biden has any hope of actually implementing important aspects of his policy agenda is if the Democrats win both of those runoff elections in Georgia. Even then, right, Joe Biden will be hampered by a very slender 1-vote majority in the Senate once Kamala Harris joins as president pro tem, and a very narrow majority in the House as well, right? And so Joe Biden clearly has won this election, but I also want to be clear that this is not a decisive repudiation of Donald Trump, of the kind, I'm sorry, that some Democrats had hoped for in this election. And I looked with you before at this diagram. I just want you to see, right, this measures county by county where the votes shifted from 2016 to 2020. And the thing you can see, and again, you can't really see unless you do a lot of analysis, is that there are very few places that were already red that moved in a blue direction. That is to say, where Trump did well that shifted to the Democrats. And there are very few places where the Democrats did well that shifted in the opposite direction. What we're seeing in this map is that the pre-existing political trends mainly accelerated from 2016 to 2020. The blues got bluer, the reds got redder. The exceptions are, of course, the states that flipped: Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. But now, let me show you one more thing about Biden's margin of victory in those critical states. And this is why I think that we really do need to view this election, as I think I said in the title to this slide, as simultaneous blue and red waves, in which the blue wave was just barely large enough to offset, counteract Donald Trump's second red wave. So when we look at the overall number of votes, right, and put this in historical perspective, what we see is that Joe Biden won more popular votes than any presidential candidate in American history. But please note that Donald Trump in this election in 2020 won the second most of any presidential candidate ever, considerably more than Barack Obama won in 2008, who's in third place, right? And one of the things to notice is that the turnout in this race was higher than any turnout in a century, since 1900, as it turns out, not only in numbers, but as a percentage of eligible voters, where we've generally been moving down in recent elections. And now to really, I think, appreciate how close this election was, you need to recognize that if 85,000 votes went differently, right? In Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Nevada, Trump wins the electoral college vote. What that means is that this vote was decided by 0.05% of the votes cast in this election. And so in a sense, if you want to ask what the effective margin of victory for Biden was, not the votes he got in places that didn't help him, but the amount of votes that actually pushed him to an electoral college majority, it is a tiny sliver of the votes. And another way to put this is, right, Biden's popular vote victory is about 5 million, right? That's exactly the margin of his victory in California. So if you subtracted California, essentially the rest of the country was tied. And this raises a very important question, right? Would Trump have won if it weren't for the pandemic? And I'm not saying he would have, right? There are other things that dragged him down, and there are respects in which probably the pandemic not only hurt, but helped Donald Trump. I'll get into that in a little bit. But all of this to say, right, to the extent that people who are pundits, people who support the Democrats, expected a major disavowal of Donald Trump, a resounding victory for Joe Biden, because we just had enough of this man and his hateful politics. That is not what happened in this election. And not only that, we are very lucky, in a sense, if we don't support Donald Trump, that the outcome turned out the way that it turned out. This was a razor thin margin. So I want to now try to put all of this in an analytic framework. I'm going to also give you some data about what happened in looking at the demographics. But before I do that, I want to look at what I'm going to call the social bases for Trump's success. And to understand why it is that he, in fact, had a second red wave that was larger than the first red wave, right? A second decisive outpouring of support, not enough to actually win the election, but enough to probably put the Senate in the Republicans' column, to erode the support of the Democrats in the House, and to indicate his ongoing electoral viability and the ongoing electoral viability of the kind of politics that Donald Trump represents, which I'm going to call Trumpism, for lack of a better term, right-wing populism of the kind that Trump represents, which I think is a uniquely American variant. And so despite what I will refer to as the nakedly opportunistic politics that Trump embodied, the way in which he attacked the norms of decency and democracy and actively endangered the country, especially through the indifferent reaction to the coronavirus. Despite all of that, he almost won another 4 years. So why is that the case? And I will give you a lot more information on this, but I'm going to start with the basic description. We live in an economically bifurcated country, what's sometimes called up or out society. That used to be a term that was used only to apply to the developing world, but it now is very much, I think, applicable to the United States as well. Either you are doing well economically, or you are left out of the wealth, the income, the mobility, the opportunity, the luxury, the bounty that our society creates, right? And that this is not just a tale of haves and have-nots, it's a tale of an economic segregation of the society, in which the areas that are coastal, located around major metropolitan areas, roughly 5 cities, are booming economically. And even the people who are not doing especially well in those areas are doing alt-right mainly. And on the other hand, there are large stretches of the center of the country that are simply not able to make the transition into an information-based economy, into a financial economy, into technology and education and medicine. The sectors of the economy that are doing very well are concentrated in certain areas and absent in other areas, right? And this supports, on the part of the people who are left out of the new sources of American opportunity, a politics of grievance and resentment, especially on the part of those who think of themselves as deserving, but nevertheless feel left out. And this is especially true of the white working class that has told a story about itself, has internalized a self-conception of deserving the opportunity, the income, the wealth, and the social standing that it garnered under the New Deal, under the great decades of the middle of the 20th century, in which the white working class in America did so well. They still think of themselves as deserving, and so when they are left out, they feel a particular sense of aggrievement and resentment, and this is poisoning our politics right now. This is a large segment of the electorate, and for them, a restoration of their past privileges appears less improbable than new pathways to security, right? And so you can ask, why not join the 21st century economy? Why not support a party that is trying to open pathways to join the economic transformation that's occurring? And the short answer is because that looks incredible. It does not look as if it's anything but magical thinking to many of these people. And if you're going to engage in magical thinking, why not engage in the magical thinking that says we can go back to where we were, where we know we were doing well, rather than having to navigate this risky and unknown path forward into a new economic situation that, as far as we can tell when we look around us, is mainly bad for us, right? And so make America great again. It's not an accident that that hit a chord with this whole segment of the electorate, and that it continues to ring true to them. So for this segment of the electorate, the threat or reality, and I want to be clear, we'll see this as we get a little bit further, but for many of these people, it's not yet that they're suffering severe downward economic mobility, but they see it around them and they worry that it's coming for them. Some of them are already cratering. It coincides with that downward mobility, either threatened or real, rapid cultural and demographic changes, right? And again, we'll talk about whether it's the fact that we've got higher rates of immigration now than we've had for any point in the last century, or an erosion of the traditional family, changing gender norms, declining rates of religion, new forms of sexuality, right? That there is all of this change occurring at the same time that economic security is being eroded, and that leads it for many to seem plausible that what explains their loss of income, security, and status is these changes in demography and culture, right? And that in a sense, this is what Trump appealed to, this sense that there's a clear and easy target for your angst translated into anger. It's much easier to deal with anger. It provides a simple and compelling explanation. That populist message, there's somebody out there to blame, they're not like us, and if you let me protect you from them, everything will be better, succeeded in 2016, and it succeeded again in 2020. It was slightly modified, right? We include now the Chinese as to blame not only for our economic downturn, but also for the coronavirus, right? And then I just want to add one more thing here, which is that much of this involves distorting reality, right? It's not an accurate understanding of the forces of change in the United States. But it is the case that many people did do better economically under Donald Trump. And some of those people were actually in this segment of downwardly mobile people who appealed to him or whom he appealed to in 2016. So if this is correct, right, if Trump's populism, nationalism, politics of blaming outsiders for American problems succeeded in 2020 in many respects as well or better than it succeeded in 2016, what does this tell us about, among other things, Trump's future and the future of the Republican Party? And here I'm going to harken back for a moment. You may remember in the aftermath of Mitt Romney's decisive loss to Barack Obama in 2012, the Republican Party commissioned a post-mortem report, right? And that report basically said that the party is going to have to do better at appealing to a more diverse electorate if it's going to have future electoral success. And on the other hand, that seems very difficult for the Republican Party to accomplish. I'll say a little bit more about this when we get into things further, but generally speaking, it's perilous work for a well-established political party to reform its coalition and its identity once it's become established and rigid, right? More parties, historically speaking, actually go under than succeed in performing that task. And so the post-mortem on the 2012 election, in a sense, suggested that the Republicans faced a choice between two very risky paths: continue along its current trend, in which case it would be less and less able to assemble a national majority, or try to reform itself, in which case it might alienate its core base. And what Donald Trump showed the Republicans is a prospect for assembling a national winning coalition. And I want to be careful. I should not have written majority here. Although, please note, it's not that far off a majority. But it is a winning coalition, and it's a winning coalition because of the way in which the Electoral College amplifies the power of less populous and less representative states, and because of the way in which the Senate amplifies the power of less populous states. And so there's a path to victory for the Republicans, electoral victory, that does not involve doing the very risky work of trying to assemble a new coalition while retaining its base. And so this is why Trump is so powerful within the Republican Party. It's not just that he threatens to bully and undermine anybody who doesn't conform to his often odd or frankly counterproductive ideas. It is that he is electoral catnip for a party that did not see a secure path forward until Donald Trump came along. Now, having said that, the Trumpist alternative for the Republican Party depends on a series of strategies, right? Mobilizing a revanchist minority base, right? And revanchist, I'm sorry, that's an old Marxist terminology, and it goes back to Europe in the early 20th century. This is essentially a way of saying white nationalism. It's a way of saying, right, we want our privilege back. We want to not have to share power with other groups that we don't think of as belonging or as legitimate, as rooted in the ethnic identity that we see as the dominant ethnic identity of our society. So it's not an accident that Trump plays the race card, that he uses dog whistles and bullhorns all the time. This is the way in which you mobilize this base. It is a politics of racial resentment. This involves then also doing everything in your power to suppress, disempower, and delegitimize an ascending majority, right? And so, although I point out that the 5 million more votes that Biden got than Trump will get, roughly speaking, are in a sense all in California, and in another sense they're not, right? They're diffuse across the country, and clearly this means that Biden gets more votes. And this is, I think it's 7th out of 8 presidential elections in this century in which the Democrats get more votes than the Republicans do. This is true in general for congressional elections, where if it not for gerrymandering, the Democrats would typically gain a majority of the House of Representatives. It is true for the Senate as well, where the constitutional gerrymander that says each state gets 2 senators irrespective of population results in the Republicans having more senators despite always in this century getting fewer votes in Senate races, right? And so what the strategy involves doing is not acknowledging the legitimacy of this new majority, which is urban, which is diverse, which is rooted in a new economy that is not a manufacturing, but instead a post-industrial economy. It involves doing things like voter suppression, gerrymandering, etc., as not just an occasional dark strategy that you try to get away with when you can, but as the avowed approach of the party, right? And so, again, don't think that the unsavory aspects of Trump's politics, trying to manipulate the census to undercount the changes in our society so that they don't have to be taken into account in congressional districting, for instance, don't think that that's incidental to him. This is, as long as Trumpism remains the only viable political strategy for the Republican Party, where the Republican Party will be concentrating its efforts for the foreseeable future. Third, this involves denying not only norms, democratic norms like the loyal opposition, which I'll get to in a moment, but also, in a sense, reality whenever they conflict with strategic imperatives, denying that there is a newly ascending majority out there, that they are less traditional, less white, less rooted in a manufacturing economy, and simply not only denying the legitimacy, but to the maximum degree possible, denying the reality of this for your core constituencies. I'll get to this in a few minutes, but the fact that the Republicans, and again, this is, well, one way to put this is that more foreign heads of state have called to congratulate Joe Biden than have senior members of the Republican Party, right? Very peculiar circumstance, one which involves, in a sense, denying the obvious math, the outcome of this electoral contest. But having said that, again, we shouldn't be surprised because, in a sense, the Republican Party is committed as a kind of existential premise of its 21st century electoral viability to denying the reality of demographic changes and their consequences for the electorate. Finally, this also involves denying the idea of the loyal opposition and what I call Madisonian majorities. That's a phrase that goes back to Lonnie Guinier, and she points to Federalist number 10, in which James Madison said, well, one of the good things about living in a large republic is that you have shifting majorities. And so when one group wins, when one coalition holds power, it recognizes that it's unlikely that it's going to be able to retain that power, and that therefore it's going to have to work with the other groups in order to maybe reconstitute its majority later, or so that they don't oppress them when they gain the majority. And this is central to the way in which American government is supposed to work. But I'm afraid that the Republicans at this point are committed to an alternative strategy, and that is one of leveraging their minority power through the institutional channels the Constitution creates to, on the one hand, rule as much as they can, and on the other hand, obstruct whenever not fully in control of the federal government, right? And so I think one of the lessons we can draw from the near success of Donald Trump in 2020 is, in a sense, that the McConnell strategy of the Obama administration succeeded in preventing the Democrats from forging a broader majority by doing things, implementing policy that is good for the working class and bringing some of the white working class into the Democratic coalition. So again, this is a strategic imperative. It's not just Mitch McConnell's personality or instrumentalism when it comes to the use of power. This is rooted in the structural situation, the only electoral path open to the Republicans, that they have to block what Biden and the Democrats will try to do in 2021, every bit as much as they had to block what Obama was trying to do in 2009. And so then when we think about the implications for Biden and the Democrats, I think the first, and in a sense, it's unfortunate, but it does seem to me to be the reality of contemporary partisan competition. The Democrats must aim to permanently exclude from power the Republican Party, or at least its Trumpist iteration, right? As long as the Republican Party remains committed to voter suppression, to gerrymandering, to obstruction, to not solving the problems of its own constituents, because maintaining its constituents' precariousness maintains their anger and resentment. And this is, in fact, what motivates them to vote for the Republican Party. It also, of course, allows the Republicans to be the party of big business and tax cuts, which funds their operations, right? So as long as the Republican Party remains committed to this strategy, the Democrats have to try to exclude them from power. Of course, parties operate in the House of Power. This, in a sense, is what they're always trying to do. But it's one thing to say the other party has a rival vision of what is good for the country. We have ours, they have theirs. And although we think ours is better, we recognize that theirs is a rival vision. I think at this point, Democrats should disabuse themselves of that way of thinking and suggest instead that the Republican Party, not the Republican rank and file, I want to be clear about this. I am talking about partisan elites, elected officials, not ordinary voters, have put themselves on a path in which what they are doing does not represent a viable vision of what is good for the country. So this means that the Democrats, in order to keep the Republicans out of power until they set on a different path, until they disavow the Trumpist strategy, have to work to win over to their coalition a share of the voters who support Trump. And this started to happen in 2020. I'll show you a little bit of data on this in a few minutes, but it needs to happen to a greater degree. And I don't think this is an impossible thing to do. A significant portion of the voters who voted for Trump also voted for Obama. And so there's a path back to getting them into the Democratic coalition, but that involves understanding their situation and, in a sense, trying to address as sympathetically as possible the root causes of their attraction to Trump. And so note the division I'm suggesting here. Do not believe you can work with Republican elected officials, but do believe that you can actually appeal to, through the right kind of policy and the right kind of messaging, Republican voters. I think that's the line the Democrats will have to walk once they digest the lesson of 2020. So third big lesson here, they can't expect even minimal cooperation from the Republicans. They will obstruct. I said in the previous slide, except for on issues of genuine national emergency, clear national emergency. And I anticipate on some of those issues that the Democrats may in fact get cooperation from the Republicans, but that will only be because it would be discrediting for the Republicans not to cooperate even on those issues. And fourth lesson, we should not expect Trump or Trumpism to recede in importance in American politics, right? And so what we're seeing on the part of the Republicans right now, I believe, is a competition to claim the mantle of Trump going forward, right? Assuming that Donald Trump isn't going to run for the presidency in 2024 because he'll be too old. I'm not sure that's a safe assumption. He's already putting out feelers, apparently, about doing it. But assuming that's not the case, is it Mike Pompeo or Pence or Cruz? Who is it that gets to claim the mantle of being the legitimate heir to Donald Trump? That seems to be the conversation the Republicans are having right now. And if that's correct, then even if Donald Trump has to spend his time defending himself against criminal prosecution or his business empire against collapse, he will have a lasting impact on American politics in that his style of politics will continue to be an important force in our politics going forward. And final thing I want to say here is that if the Democrats do not understand the powerful appeal of Trumpism, they risk repeating the failures of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, right? Which is to say, they underestimate the level of anger, anxiety, and resentment in those parts of our society that feel that they have been left out of this economy, that the society is changing in ways that are hostile and frightening to them, and that they want a politician who will hit the brakes. I'm not saying that Joe Biden should be that politician, but he needs to understand where the ongoing appeal of Trump, despite the obvious problems in his 4 years in power, where that appeal comes from. So now let's look a little bit about what's happened in the electorate. And I would note to you, I'm getting this data from the exit polls conducted primarily by Edison Research, in this case reported by the BBC. The exit polling was not particularly good in this election cycle. It wasn't good because a lot of people didn't vote at the polls, weren't there to poll, right? Didn't vote in person, I guess would be the clear way to say that. And so this is very preliminary data. We'll have to get more information. But as we can see, there is an ongoing gender gap. It became even more extreme in 2020. There is an ongoing racial gap in the electorate in which white people voted dominantly for Donald Trump, not quite as dominantly as in 2016, Black people voted overwhelmingly for Joe Biden, although not quite as overwhelmingly as they voted for Hillary Clinton. And I want to be careful here. Let me say one thing to begin with. Black people voted 87% for Joe Biden, right? 92% for Hillary Clinton. And so you might say that Hillary Clinton did better with African Americans than Joe Biden did. But I believe, if I've got this right, what we will see when we do the numbers is that more Black people voted in 2020 than voted in 2016. More African Americans voted in Michigan and Pennsylvania and Georgia, the states that actually pushed Joe Biden over the line. And so although Biden didn't win as large a share of the African American vote as Hillary Clinton did, he probably won more Black votes. And that is integral to his success, to the fact that he won this incredibly narrow victory in 2020. Similarly, we see an erosion of support for the Democrats from Latinos, and this was particularly important in South Florida and South Texas, and made both of those states fairly comfortably in Trump's column. But again, although the rate of support for Trump went up, the level of Latino turnout went up in, for instance, Arizona. And so that probably, again, is important to pushing Biden into his rather narrow win. Asian voters also shifted a little bit in Trump's direction, but still were very strongly pro-Democrat. Younger voters voted more for the Democrats, older voters more for Trump, although Trump saw a significant erosion of his support for older voters, to the point where this is a very small difference, right? And so what we see is the Democrats basically carrying every age segment except for voters over 65, and voters over 65 becoming very close. Once again, voters without a college degree voted strongly for Donald Trump. Though the data here indicates that it's basically a tie, the way in which this vote is distributed geographically is very important for Trump's near win in this election. And again, voters with a college degree voted primarily for the Democrats, and this number went up in 2020 relative to 2016. So let me just point out a little bit of the details here in terms of demographics. And what you can see, right, is that, sorry, I'm trying to get my face out of the way. Here we go. That Trump lost support among older voters compared, and so this is data that compares 2016 to 2020 explicitly. And as you can see, in the 45 to 65-year-old group, Trump won a substantial victory in 2016. It was narrowed to almost a tie in 2020. That's the largest shift. And then 65 or older, what you see is a narrowing of Trump's advantage. Similarly, for white men, and this is, I think, very important, right? We're used to a gender gap in a sense, right? There wasn't much room for Biden to do better with women than Clinton had done. And so he improved slightly for women without a college degree over Clinton's margin, +7 to +9, stayed exactly where Clinton was for white women. I'm sorry, that is with a college degree, not without a college degree. Stayed exactly where Clinton was for white women with no college degree, which is trailing Trump substantially, but not nearly as substantially as with men without a college degree, right? But then when we look at men with a college degree, we see a dramatic narrowing of Trump's advantage from 14% in 2016 to 3% in 2020. And I'm going to say more about this. I think clearly the gender of the candidate is a factor here. There were a bunch of men who felt more comfortable voting for Joe Biden than for Hillary Clinton, and that reflects the ongoing sexism of the American electorate. But having said that, I don't think it's only about the gender of the candidate. It's also about economics, and I'll say more about that in a moment. Whereas white men with no degree, Trump lost some support among them, but not nearly as a dramatic an erosion as with the men with the college degrees. Here's another way of looking at this, and this is much more geographically, and this is where I'll focus for the remainder of today's lecture, and this is looking at the suburbs, and in particular, the more affluent and diverse suburbs. And what we see, and the ones that are coded in orange, are in battleground or swing states, and that the larger the dot, the larger the suburb, right? If they would be perfectly on the 45-degree line, the perpendicular line on this diagram, that would mean that they stayed put from 2016 to 2020. And you can see there are some relatively small counties in the suburbs that moved in the direction of Trump. But generally speaking, suburban counties moved in the direction of Biden. And in particular, these are the more densely populated, more affluent, more diverse, closer into the city suburbs that went for Trump marginally in 2016 and went for Biden marginally in 2020. And I want to conclude by suggesting that this is about the economics of those areas. And so to be clear, right, when you asked people again on the exit polls with all their limitations, what the number one issue was for them, by far and away, the largest issue was the economy. Now, please note that the second largest issue was racial inequality, and that is unprecedented in recent American history, right? Not since the 1960s has race been on our minds as such an explicit issue in our politics. Yes, it's been dog whistled in the past, but that doesn't lead people to say that they're voting on the basis of racial inequality. That's an important change. And so again, if you want to ask what changed in 2020, one of the big things that changed is George Floyd catalyzed the Black Lives Matter movement, and Donald Trump misplayed his hand badly on that movement. Or maybe the better way to put it is he was structurally constrained because the group that he wanted to appeal to would not allow him to be more progressive or sympathetic or understanding in the reaction he had to the Black Lives Matter movement. Third issue, the coronavirus pandemic, crime, safety, and healthcare policy tied in terms of the fourth or fifth issue. Now look at how it breaks down. If you're in that largest group, the economy, 83% of you voted for Donald Trump, less than 20% for Joe Biden. If you're in that second group, right, racial inequality, 90% plus voted for Biden, less than 10% for Trump. If you're in that third group, and note that the second and third together are larger than the economy, right? The coronavirus dominantly supporting Joe Biden. When you look at crime and safety, dominantly supporting the president. And then if you look at healthcare policy, a big advantage for Joe Biden, right? And so that gives you a sense, I hope, of the issues, what we understand right now about the basis on which voters were voting in 2020. I now want to focus in on the economy as that most important variable. And here I want to look at some recent research on the economic bases of Trumpism, right? And I'll speak specifically of the economic geography. And here we're looking at counties that voted primarily for Trump and counties that voted primarily for Biden. And what we see is substantial differences between those counties. So counties that voted for, where voters moved from supporting Trump to voting for Biden had a high percentage of college degrees, high medium household income, high projected job growth. And if you now look at another variable, routine jobs, and I want to say a little bit more about this category. I'm drawing on some recent work in the New York Times to get this data, as well as some recent sociological scholarship. A routine job is a job in manufacturing, or a job in agriculture, or a job in the service industry where the work itself is routine, where it involves doing the same thing again and again and again. And what is the case, especially in the midst of the pandemic, is that this work is highly susceptible to automation, whether that's literally robotics taking your job from you, or a computer program or algorithm doing what you do better than you do it, right? And so these are people who experience genuine economic vulnerability right now. And so when we look at the counties that voted for Trump, they have certain core economic attributes. They have worse health outcomes. I've shown you diagrams on this before. They have lower social mobility. Basically, people born in the bottom, stuck in the bottom of society. They have less social capital, where that involves the level of education and the kind of network that you have, and the way in which that's generative of economic opportunity for you. They also have greater reliance on Social Security for income. They're older, and the people there are not generating their own income. They have higher rates of deaths of despair from suicide, alcoholism, drug addiction, and overdose. They have lower adjusted incomes. And I want to say something about this for a moment. The cost of living is higher in the counties where Biden won. Houses cost more, rents are higher, other aspects of the bundle of goods people need to live are more expensive. But their income is higher even relative to their expenses, right? And so although the Trump counties are cheaper places to live, the income is still not keeping up with the cost of living. So adjusted income is lower in Trump counties than in Biden counties. They have a worse job mix. And so are these jobs that are likely to be automated, or subject to robotics, or outsourced overseas, right? Are these jobs with a prospect for staying there and continuing to generate income? Worst job mix in the Trump counties. And so one way to summarize this is that it is rational to have economic fear for the future in the Trump counties, and Trump is building on that fear, is transposing that fear into anger at others, especially other nationals when they immigrate, and racial others. And so when we go through all these economic indicators of where Trump is doing well, I want you to remember that race and religion are cross-cutting factors as well. That is to say, in a place like areas in Utah, where actually they're doing very well economically, the fact that they are all white and perhaps more religious increases their support for Trump. In places like Fresno in California, where in fact they look economically like a Trump county, the fact that they are primarily Latino increases the support for Biden. So this is not economics alone, but economics is extremely important, especially in predicting the behavior of white voters. And then finally, when we look at the alternative picture, not what's happening in the Trump counties, but what's happening in the Biden counties, we can see just a different economic world, right? Cost of living is higher, but the non-routine jobs are much more prevalent. They're 2/3, 3/4 of the jobs in the Biden counties. And the education level is much higher. Median household income is much higher. The likelihood that jobs will grow is much higher. And the income inequality is high, but not extraordinary. Most people are doing pretty well. Their prices, their wealth is increasing because if they own homes, the value of their homes is increasing. I won't continue, but I hope you're understanding that we are an economically fractured country and that the divide that we're seeing in our politics mirrors the divide that we're seeing in our economy, and that is creating fertile ground for the kind of politics that Trump peddled in 2016 and 2020. And you can bet there will be future political entrepreneurs who do it as well or better than Trump did it. And so we just have to beware. I won't go into this in too much detail. This is those routine jobs. And as you can see, places with less routine jobs, Trump did less well in 2020 than he did in 2016. Places with more routine jobs, Trump actually did slightly better in 2020 than he did in 2016. I want to say now just a couple more things. We are, let us hope, going to get the coronavirus under control in 2021. The news on a vaccine is good news. We will have more effective national policy when we have a new president. It's almost impossible to believe that we won't have more effective national policy because we essentially don't have national policy at the moment. We will have a president who uses the bully pulpit to model responsible behavior for us. We certainly can hope that we will enter an economic recovery as well in 2021. And so we should be looking at what happened with the previous economic recovery, the economic recovery from the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. And what we can see is that in the immediate aftermath of that recession, almost all of the gains from economic expansion went to the top 1%. That tiny little sliver at the bottom is the bottom 99%. This is highly skewed to the top. This is an upper out society. Things got worse as the economy recovered. And this is under Barack Obama's leadership, right? And so in a sense, we shouldn't be surprised that the voters in red counties are skeptical about Joe Biden and the Democrats. Why should they believe that things will be better in 2020, 2021, 2022 than they were in 2009, 2010, 2011? And one consequence of the way in which we recovered from that recession is what Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winning economist, calls an economy without shock absorbers. And so these are two different ways of measuring how much Americans have in savings, right? One of them is just to ask them. This is a survey conducted in late 2019, where 45% of the people who responded to the survey said, we don't have any savings at all. Another 24%, so now we're up to 70% of the population, said they have less than $1,000. And when the Federal Reserve used banking data to look at this, they found that 1/3 of the population has no savings, and 1/3 of the population has $1,000 or less. And so that for 50% of Americans, they have $400 in savings or less. So if you ask, when you prioritize the economy, when you tell people that's why you voted, why did you vote for Donald Trump, right? Hasn't he made the virus worse? Isn't that what's dragging the economy down? And I think you have to bear in mind that for a significant portion of Americans, the idea of a lockdown, the idea of being forced to not work for even a week may exhaust their savings, may put them in a situation in which they are unable to pay rent and eat at the same time, afford their medical care expenses, and send their kids to school in decent clothes, right? Those are the trade-offs that people who have little to no savings make when they're out of work for a week or two. And again, Joe Biden needs to be reckoning with this. Yes, it makes sense. Yes, it's smart to bring the virus under control. But given what's happening in our economy, it's also the case that that has to be accompanied with meaningful support for those who do not have the resources to be okay over the period in which they are going to be kept out of work. I will stop there. I know I just threw a lot at you. As always, want to hear your questions, thoughts, comments. I'm going to go ahead and unmute everyone. That does mean that your background noise will pick up, so try to, if you can, keep it down. And oh my goodness, John Campbell has the first question. Go ahead, John.
You dazzled me to the point that it drives the question out of my mind. Oh, you've just pointed out, however, that the number one goal for Mitch McConnell and the Republicans will be to prevent the Democrats from doing anything to help all those people that don't have any income. I suppose you can make a very credible case that this is a national emergency and that the Republicans are going to have to respond. And with the election in Georgia coming up, responding before January 5th would make sense for them. But nonetheless, the thinking seems to be that McConnell's probably not going to take that tack. He's probably going to try and clamp down as much as possible and figure, chaos will benefit them.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And so that raises the question. If McConnell will obstruct anything that Biden tries, even if it is another coronavirus relief package, right? Another CARES package. And I didn't share this data with you. Let me share this with you for a moment. This is just so striking. I didn't want to crowd out time for discussion, but things got better under Trump. And so it's worthwhile noting more Americans answered the question positively. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago in September 2020 than had in the previous election cycles going all the way back to Ronald Reagan, in which an incumbent president was running for re-election? So that's striking. But it's also, in a sense, true. And so what you see here is disposable personal income went up, right? And I took this stuff from the Federal Reserve and isolated the period from January 2016 to the most recent data, which is from late July 2020. But look at what happened during the coronavirus period, right? Which is to say that disposable income went up. And this is a result of the CARES Act, right? And then it went back down when that act expired. And so that's just one way of measuring the effectiveness of federal income support legislation when it provides emergency unemployment benefits. And what can Biden do to get McConnell to do anything or anything adequate to the vast dimensions of the problem? And here I would say he's got to shame Biden. He's got to call it like it is, which is to say that the Republicans are blocking things that are good for their own constituents in order to gain short-term electoral advantage. That's not a bipartisan move, right, in a sense, but that's attacking the leadership of the Republican Party in order to go over their heads, in order to appeal to their electorate. I think that's the only avenue open to Biden if I read McConnell's incentives correctly. I'm looking at the chat bar, and John asked if I know that you are in quarantine with 2 cases, and I absolutely did not know that, and I'm really very sorry to hear that. And I recognize, as you may know, I speak at some other retirement communities. These are difficult times, and my thoughts are with you. And I know that it's not easy to be in quarantine, but I do hope that you also recognize that it's necessary, and that it's important for your safety that you not only abide by, but support the staff in doing what they have to do. I see Gloria. Give me one moment. I'm just going to look at Bob Jorger's comment. Is Bob still here? Do I say Jorger or Jorger?
Jorger.
Jorger. Okay. Split the difference, right? If Trump is not smart enough to understand this, who's behind these strategies? I want to say, in a sense, Trump is obviously not looking over the data that we just looked over together. But I think in another respect, Trump has an intuitive sense for this. And this is often the case with populist leaders. They feel the same resentment, the same grievance, the same anger that their supporters feel. And for that reason, they're very good at channeling it, even if they don't necessarily understand the social forces that are generating it. And so there's a, Trump has relied on his intuitions and his gut throughout his career. Very often he doesn't do very well by it. But in this case, he's peddling what a lot of people want to buy. Gloria, go ahead.
Well, that's related to what I wanted to ask. Which comes first? McConnell causes the hate and to bubble up in the people, or is it the hate in the people bring a McConnell in, or Trump, whichever?
Yeah, no. It's a classic chicken and egg problem, and so let me complicate the picture even a little bit more for you, right? Which is to say, and this is one of the reasons I think the Republican Party faces such a difficult choice about trying to rework its constituency. It's rested on 3 pillars for really the last 50 years. And those pillars are evangelical Protestants, right? White working class people since Ronald Reagan, and the wealthy, including the business elite, right? And they've relied on the wealthy and the business elite to fund their operations. By the way, the Democrats are also increasingly dependent for their finances on the wealthy as well. It's not as if this is all a problem with the Republicans. I would say very clearly, again, I had some information in the slides I didn't get to, that the Democrats have not earned the confidence of the white working class because they have not pursued policies that have been beneficial to them either, in part because McConnell obstructed, in part because Obama and Clinton were beholden to the very rich for the financing not only of their own campaigns, but of the national party, right? Of hundreds of campaigns for Congress, for Senate, etc. And so the other variable here is the ability of industries, of lobbyists, of the wealthy to prevent policies that are bad for their concentrated economic interests, but good for the majority of workers in that sector. And so this is sometimes referred to as policy drift. McConnell has been a major force of policy drift. He's prevented Obama from implementing policies that would have benefited his own constituencies, the constituency of the Republican Party. But he's not done it alone. He's done it because so many politicians of both parties are structurally dependent on their financing from the very industries they might seek to regulate, to tax, to structure in a way that's good for their workers. And so I'm not sure I've answered your question. I'm not sure I've got a really good answer for your question, Gloria. It's a tough one. But it's not as if this started with McConnell and Trump, right? This started with the Reagan Revolution, with changes in our approach to the money supply and employment and inflation, all of which we sometimes, pile together under the phrase neoliberalism in economic policy, right? And so this has been going on for a long time, and it's a complicated story. It involves the Koch brothers, etc. It involves Citizens United. It involves the role of money in our politics, which has distorted not only what the Republicans do, but also what the Democrats do. In that environment, Donald Trump represents a powerful path to electoral success for the Republicans, right? And I'm not trying to give you a total picture of how we got from the New Deal to neoliberalism to Donald Trump, but trying to get us to wrestle with the fact, reckon with the fact that in 2020, Trumpism is very much alive and well as an electoral strategy for the Republicans.
There is no going back.
There's only going forward, right? And going forward is possible. It's difficult, but yes, what we need is a new approach from the Democrats, and Biden, who I think by disposition is a consensus politician, does not like playing partisan hardball, is going to have to develop the mettle for the battle if he's going to have success in this climate with this party, who will, probably control the Senate, and if so, try to block him at every path. I saw John raising his hand again. I couldn't tell. Flossie, were you? You are.
Yes. One question.
Go ahead.
Our community gets a lot of mail from all kinds of organizations that need our little checks. I have a big envelope from Citizens United, among other pleas for money. So I have to decide which group gets the next check. And what I'm hearing is that it should go to Citizens United.
So I don't know what organization you're referring to, Flossie, and so
the group that you just described. This
Well,
is a plea to investigate and try to get rid of this group of people who support Mitch McConnell, who support Chuck Grassley, the whole cadre. And so if I have 20 requests from the CDC, any number of groups that are legitimate, but the money can go only so far. From what I'm hearing right now, because I chuck a lot of it, is that any check that goes to get rid of or investigate Citizens United is an important check.
Yes, and let me immediately say that I'm dismayed to have to say that with the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court, I think we focused an awful lot on, abortion or the Affordable Care Act. But this cements the majority on the Supreme Court for this line of jurisprudence, as far as I can tell. And so, yeah, I don't know what strategy the group you're dealing with is embracing, but I'm not sure what the end run is around the Supreme Court right now for dealing with Citizens United. So I, unfortunately, have to give another lecture in 5 minutes. And so I'm going to have to say goodbye. Obviously, I ran over today, and I absolutely love spending my Saturdays with you all. But I do have to go because I've got another group that's going to be waiting for me, and I don't want to be too late for them.
And
I also want to get my drink.
yes.
So take care, everyone. Hang in there. I did just see the news about quarantine. Please do take care, and I will see you all next week. Best wishes. Bye-bye.
Fritz.
Thank you. Thank you.
Comes without power.